Hello everyone. So, you're wondering, did the bear dimension actually start with cheese? Yes, as far as I know, it actually started with cheese. Because one evening, my late husband was having his usual snack of cheese and olives at 5 p.m., which he liked to do. And I was helping him, of course, it being cheese, and it was very cold. So I was moaning and groaning and leaning over the radiator and saying, cheese bears don't like the cold. And he said, Siberian cheese bears then. And I said, one day I'm going to write a story about a Siberian cheese bear. And thereby exploded a whole universe. You know how they talk about the beginning of the galaxy of the universe, there was a big bang. Well, I think that's kind of symbolically what happened, because just the idea of this Siberian cheese bear prompted the idea that if there was a Siberian cheese bear, perhaps there could be all sorts of other types of bears. So I sat at the computer, we swapped places because I can type faster, and he was walking up and down throwing out ideas, and I was throwing out ideas, and we were throwing it all onto the computer. And that's actually where this whole universe, this 7 planets, over 40 types of bears, rabbit and Darwin, where that all started. So I thought it actually was a very auspicious sort of time to be reading you the story of the Siberian cheese bear. Professor Darwin came down to breakfast whistling. He was looking very smart in an orange waistcoat. You're bright and cheerful today, Rabbit said. Is something special going on? Darwin chuckled. Today, Rabbit, I am going to write about the Siberian cheese bear. Many years ago, I wrote a short book about these bears. Little did I know that what I wrote would years later be included in such an important work for bearkind. I went to great lengths to get the information that happens to include a rather interesting story. Darwin's good mood lasted all through breakfast. They didn't start work until mid-morning, because he insisted on going into the loft and to find a copy of his book. He spent ages telling Rabbit how hard he had worked and how everyone had loved it. He kept opening it up, sneezing from the dust, and reading out his favourite parts. Rabbit didn't mind. It was great to see Darwin so cheerful. He had plenty of carrots to chew and a new fountain pen to fiddle with, so he was enjoying himself. Finally, they sat down to write the story itself. That is to say, Rabbit sat in his usual position by the tape recorder, and Darwin swaggered about, twirling his pocket watch chain and clearing his throat more than was strictly necessary. Siberian cheese bears are one of the oldest recorded species of bear. They started off as rather similar to the polar bear and lived in northern Siberia on Eternia, where the temperatures range from really cold to absolutely freezing. Today they live in much warmer places and go to great lengths to avoid the cold. They do still eat ice cheese, however, which is considered a great treat. It made up the main part of their ancestors' diet, as they didn't have heat to waste on cooking. Darwin glanced at Rabbit, who seemed ever so slightly dozy, so he prodded him, just to make sure he was listening. Rabbit sat up at once, his ears standing to attention. This story starts, said Darwin, with a proverb. Rabbit looked at him suspiciously. I like stories, not proverbs. Will it take long? What is a proverb, anyway? Darwin sighed and switched off the tape recorder. It's a saying that tells an important truth about life. I once knew someone who was so clever that he only spoke in proverbs. He was one of the great minds of our time. I bet he couldn't tell stories, though, Rabbit said. So about this proverb, hadn't we better get on with it so we can get to the story? Darwin gave him a withering look and continued his recording. The proverb goes, a bear may look at a king, but a king may not look at a bear's cheese unless he is invited. Siberian cheese bears are very protective of their cheese. It's not that they aren't generous, but that they see cheese as sacred. Cheese may be sold or shared, but it must be treated with respect. It should be admired, smelled and talked about, then cut with a proper cheese slice and eaten with great enjoyment. A Siberian Cheese Bear would tell you that if you want to create something as special as cheese, you have to put in the proper time, effort and care. For a cheese bear, it is an important process and should be done in a calm, unhurried way. All the better to produce cheese of amazing quality. So to come back to the proverb, cheese may be good enough for a king, but there are some lines that even a king shouldn't cross. There, I hope that wasn't too painful for you, Rabbit. Darwin's sarcasm was lost on Rabbit, who simply sat with an expectant look on his face. Darwin sighed and gave up. He may as well just start the story. King Dinglebat IV was a keen bird watcher. One day, he went out to look for the very rare coconut kaka bird, which had been spotted in the mountains by one of his royal spotters. It was a lovely day for a walk, and soon he was seated on his royal birdwatcher perch, with binoculars pressed up against his face. After several hours of waiting, he was rewarded with the sight of not one, but a pair of coconut kaka birds. He clicked away with his royal camera and heaved a satisfied sigh. Then he realised he was hungry. He also realised one other thing. He'd forgotten the royal hamper. Still, he was king after all, and he was sure that if he could find a house, one of his subjects would be very pleased to offer him a meal. He didn't have to go far before a wonderful smell met his nose. He took a huge sniff. Ah, cheese on toast if he wasn't mistaken. And he usually wasn't, as everyone pretended he'd got things right, even when he hadn't. He followed the inviting smell and found a large white bear setting a table for lunch. "I say, old chap," the king said, "I don't suppose there's room for one more, is there? I've gone and forgotten the royal hamper, and I'm feeling rather peckish." The bear, whose name was Edgar, was delighted to be able to offer his cheese on toast to such an important guest, and hurried away to make more. They shared a tasty lunch of some very fine cheese on toast. It was so fine, in fact, that the king couldn't help thinking what a wonderful king he would be if he could present such a cheese to his subjects. He could always ask for the recipe, but he didn't want to share the credit if he didn't have to. He was sure he could find a solution. "This is wonderful cheese, Edgar. Did you make it?" "I most certainly did. This cheese is one of my latest and best, if I may say so myself." "Well, old chap, it's marvellous. I expect it's a secret recipe, kept under lock and key." "Oh no, not at all. I keep my recipes written down in my kitchen for a while, but then I tend to throw them in the bin, as once I've memorised something, I never forget it." Yes, of course," the king said, trying not to sound as excited as he felt. "Well, that's very clever, I'm sure." As soon as he was back at the palace, he sent one of his royal guards to keep watch on Edgar's house and to go through the rubbish bins. He was going to have that recipe for himself. Sure enough, it wasn't long before the guard was back at the palace with something that looked just like a recipe for cheese. He handed it to the king, who was delighted with the success of his scheme. Little did he know, the ingredients were there, but the finer details of the cheese-making process were missing, as cheese bears never need to write them down. Unaware of this, the king sent the recipe to his kitchens and told them to make as much of this cheese as possible. Then he asked his marketing team to work on a sales pitch. He was sure that introducing this wonderful cheese to the bear dimension would increase his royal reputation no end. Edgar lived in the mountains, so he was unlikely to discover what the king had done. And anyway, he reminded himself, I am the king. Everything belonged to him, including the bear and his recipes, so there shouldn't be a problem. 4 weeks later, after the minimum ripening time, the cheese was ready for sale. The royal kitchens had been working flat out, and the marketing team had come up with a great slogan to encourage sales. Unfortunately, King Dinglebat stuck his royal nose in, and their idea was cast aside in favour of his suggestion. The royal daft, favoured and flavoured by royalty. You'd have to be daft not to buy it. His reasoning was that no one likes to be called daft, especially not by royalty. The marketing team had no choice but to sigh a collective sigh and congratulate the king on his wonderful plan. Despite the terrible slogan, the king's cheese proved irresistible to his subjects, who travelled from miles around to get the chance to taste it. Word even made it to the mountains. Edgar had heard about a new royal cheese coming onto the market. He couldn't wait to try it. He made his way into town in a very good mood. After all, it wasn't far to travel. He'd crossed dimensions before in search of exceptional cheese. When he approached the castle, he stopped dead. There was a funny smell in the air. It smelled of perfume. Oh! He approached the cheese stall carefully. Maybe it was that bear beside him. The smell was quite overpowering. One single bite of the cheese was enough to tell him it wasn't the other bear at all, and that a terrible crime had been committed. It was his own recipe, but so badly botched that only the nose of a Siberian cheese bear could have recognised it. He guessed that the royal kitchens had not been sure how to make cheese, so they'd added a lot of chemicals just in case. This was an insult. An insult to himself, an insult to cheese, and to cheese bears everywhere. Edgar hurried home to try and decide what to do. Perhaps his evening snack of cheese and olives would calm him down. But alas, he'd got so upset he went right off his food. Cheese and olives at 5 p.m. was his favourite snack. He'd never been known to miss it. This was serious. Something had to be done. With the aid of many cold flannels on the head and much walking up and down, he finally came upon a plan. He set up his own stall, selling cheese with all the fullness, flavour and melt-on-the-tongue texture you'd expect from cheese made by an expert. He sold wrapped slices to go and cheese on toast to eat hot on the spot. Naturally, the wonderful smells drew the crowds away from the royal daft at speed. When news reached the palace, King Dinglebat realised that he'd been found out. Uh-oh, that cheese-making bear isn't going to be very happy with me. He started thinking hard to find a way out of the situation. "Excuse me, Your Majesty," the royal butler interrupted his train of thought before he could really get anywhere. "There's a bear outside who is certain you'll want to see him." King Dinglebat gulped and tried to remember that despite what he had done, he was king, so he really had nothing to fear. What he didn't know about Siberian cheese bears is that they are very kind-hearted, and it is not in their nature to be mean, provided, of course, that you keep them fed on a diet of quality cheeses. At that very moment, Edgar was whistling as he walked up the steps to the palace. Watching all the people enjoying his cheese had put him in a very good mood. He wasn't the type of bear to hold a grudge. In fact, he had started to feel bad for the king, given the sudden fall in his cheese sales. "Your Royal Majesty, King Dinglebat," he bowed. King Dinglebat giggled nervously as Edgar approached the throne. I say, I actually, not to worry at all, Your Majesty." Edgar, with his kind and forgiving nature, was keen to put the king at ease. "But I think there has been a mistake." "A mistake?" The king looked hopeful. "Yes, Your Majesty. I was honoured to share my recipe with your royal kitchens, but I think they might have misread the instructions. I felt you needed to know at once. Might I suggest that Your Majesty come down to the stall and test the cheese yourself to confirm my theory?" King Dinglebat nodded eagerly. "Yes, that's right," he cried. "A mistake in the royal kitchens. These things happen. And of course, you must be on hand to tell me how it should taste. I could take you on as my royal cheesemaker." The king and Edgar shared looks. They had reached an understanding. No more needed to be said. "I would be most honoured to help out." Edgar gave a very low bow. So that is what happened. The king and Edgar both got a share of the credit and the profits, and the royal daft became a respected and well-loved cheese. Edgar, of course, never told anyone about his arrangement with the king, but sometimes in the evenings, when he sat in his favourite chair, nibbling on his cheese and olives, he would chuckle away to himself. Friends often wondered, and sometimes asked him what he was laughing about. But Edgar was an honourable bear, who was loyal to the king, despite his royal daftness, and he never breathed a word. So I hope you enjoyed the story of the Siberian Cheese Bear, one of the earliest types of bears, as we know, and in fact one of the very early kings. I think I have mentioned that the Bear Dimension does have kings and queens, and you will meet one of those kings later in the second book. King Dinglebat was actually King Dinglebat the first, the second, the third, and the fourth. Well, if you're wondering how that can happen, I shall explain everything in the next video.